In rode the Lord of the Nazgul, a great black shape against the fires beyond he loomed up, grown to a vast menace of despair. In rode the Lord of the Nazgul, under the archway that no enemy ever yet had passed, and all fled before his face, all save one. There waiting, silent and still in the space before the gate, sat Gandalf upon Shadowfax. Shadowfax, who alone among the free horses of the earth endured the terror, unmoving, steadfast as a graven image in Rath-Dinin. "You cannot enter here," said Gandalf, and the huge shadow halted. "Go back to the abyss prepared for you. Go back! Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master. Go!" Hey everyone, Yoistin here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be further exploring the Return of the King and its differences between the book and movie. Now, in the last episode of this series, we finally reached the end of the content from the Two Towers book, with Shelob's lair and the choices of Master Samwise, so we are now in total Return of the King territory. What's more, the timeline is now back on track, which makes things a lot easier for me, and the events happening for one part of the story are happening at roughly the same time as the other part of the story. For more information or to catch up on this series, please check out the links in the description and cards. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me. Let us journey back into Middle-earth and begin our tale. We will start with Cirith Ungol and Sam's rescue of Frodo, happening on March 14th of 3019. In the movie, the orcs found Frodo's mithril coat and killed each other over it. Sam fought a few orcs on his way up to the top and slew one orc before that orc could kill Frodo. He rescues Frodo and gives him back the ring reluctantly, for he thought his master had been slain, so he took it. Thus, with some orc armor for disguises, they set off once more towards Mount Doom. Roughly the same happens in the book, but with more detail. Sam is only able to penetrate the darkness from statues that were watching and guarding the front gate, using the file that Galadriel gave Frodo. The orcs within were slain from each other, but a few were still alive. It seemed to them that Sam was not a hobbit, but an elf warrior, with an elvish blade and the light of Galadriel. One orc, Shagrat, would flee from him, but Sam, in the tower, could not find Frodo. So he began to sing a song, and Frodo answered. An orc was alerted by this, and Sam would attack the orc Snaga, and Snaga would fall to his doom. Like in the movie, the mithril coat would come to Barad-dûr and the mouth of Sauron. Sam would quickly search for clothes, and they took orc armor hastily. After Sam gave back the ring, and Frodo rose to anger but was calmed after he got it back, they left the tower using Galadriel's Phial of Light. Indeed, once they left, they heard the rending cry of a Nazgul in the sky above them. The tower was being watched. But for now, they were safe and went deeper into Mordor. Next, we go to Gandalf, Pippin, and the Siege of Gondor beginning on March 14th as well. In the movie, Gandalf has his work cut out for him. Between making sure Pippin is safe, the gate is not breached, and the men on the walls keep fighting, even after the dread of seeing their comrades' heads launched by catapults and the incompetence of Denethor, which made them flee their posts. Eventually, as the night progresses, Pippin finds that Denethor is going to burn himself and Faramir on a pyre, for Denethor had gone mad. There is a shot showing the white tree beginning to bloom in the movie. Now, of course, in the book, the white tree is dead and is replanted by Aragorn. Pippin was released from the steward's service and was forced to find Gandalf to save Faramir. After finding the wizard near the gate, once it had been breached by Grond and some armored trolls, they rode on Shadowfax towards the citadel and the houses of Rath-Dinin, when they were stopped by the Witch King, who broke Gandalf's staff. But before the Witch King dealt a final blow to Gandalf, a horn signaling the arrival of the Rohirom broke out, and he was forced to deal with that threat. Gandalf and Pippin continued on to save Faramir, but Denethor burned, running to the edge of the bow of the city and jumping while the battle raged below. Later on, during the battle on March 15th that same day, Gandalf and Pippin discussed death and what it truly was. And Gandalf gave a description of death, which comes from the end of the Return of the King book, for that quote is actually what Frodo sees sailing into the west, as this scene here does not occur in the book between Pippin and Gandalf. Later, Pippin would find Merry on the battlefield and would look after him. Now, speaking of the book, it actually details these events in rather different ways. First, Gandalf is not alone in his command, for he has Imrahil and the other lords of Gondor to aid him in restoring hope and strength to men on the walls and behind the gate. Eventually, Grond does breach the gate, but only with the aid of the Witch King and his spells that he put on the gate. And it was only after the gate was broken when the Witch King rode in on his black horse and was confronted by Gandalf immediately. But he did not break the wizard's staff like he did in the movie. When the horn of the Rohirrim sounded, the Witch King rode off to deal with that threat, and Gandalf was actually about to pursue him when Pippin found him with news that Denethor was about to burn Faramir. During the battle, Pippin found out what Denethor was going to do, and he had more fair words with him and tried to save his lord more here than in the movie. He also enlisted the aid of his friend Beregond, one of the guards of the citadel, who left his post and even was forced to slay some of his fellow soldiers in order to save Faramir. For Gandalf and Pippin rode to Rath Dinen and helped Beregond save Faramir, alike to how it happened in the movie, but Denethor was more fey here and driven to want his son's death even more, it seems. For he produced a palantir and a knife to slay Faramir with if the fire wouldn't work. But Beregond protected his friend and lord, even from the Steward of Gondor. Denethor and Gandalf exchanged heated words here, and Denethor revealed all he knew about the ranger from the north who would, in his words, supplant him, which of course was said earlier in the movie, without a true explanation of how he discovered this. He knew of the black sails coming up Anduin, and all of this was because of the Palantir, the Honor stone, that he had in his keeping. In his despair and with his Palantir, after breaking the Staff of Stewardship, he burned there on his pyre. Gandalf was clearly saddened by all of this, and understood now why Denethor's mind had fallen so low. Gandalf and Beregond bore the bier of Faramir to the Houses of Healing, and afterwards, Gandalf looked out from the wall, seeing Éomer's charge, and he knew that great deeds had befallen that day. Indeed, it seems Gandalf, in saving Faramir, was unable to save Theoden, which he would have done had he followed the Witch King. Later, Pippin would encounter Merry in the city, stumbling and losing his way, and Pippin would ensure he went to the Houses of Healing as well, for the Black Breath was on Merry. Now turning to the Rohirrim, in the movie, Éowyn, after being told to stay behind by both Aragorn and Theoden, rode forth with Merry, making it evident that it was her, in disguise. She believed that she and Merry would die on the battlefield, and it would all finally be over. Merry wished he was a knight capable of great deeds, but he was a hobbit. Little did he know how useful his hobbit stature would become very soon. Thus the Rohirrim finally arrived and charged into the Pelennor Fields, and Theoden broke through and routed the armies of Mordor, until the Haradrim and their Mumakil showed up. The Rohirrim fought and many died, to these men and their great creatures, but some, like Éomer and Éowyn, were able to slay a few of the beasts. Éowyn would cross swords with Gothmog in the movie version, and Merry slew some Haradrim. Theoden rallied his men, and the Witch King then found him, and broke the king's body with his steed. Éowyn, who had lost sight of Merry, was near at hand and slew the fell beast, and fought the Witch King, and with the aid of Merry, who stabbed the back of the Witch King's knee, she slew the Lord of the Nazgul. Afterwards, Éowyn spoke to Theoden and heard his final words. Once the battle was won, Éomer would find his sister's body and cry out, for she should not have been there. Now in the book there was a lot more at play, and some parts were changed. For one, Durnhelm, or Éowyn's disguise, spoke little, and Merry did not truly know who it was until she revealed herself before the Witch King. As the Rohirrim rode closer to Gondor, they realized that the road they were taking was blocked by an orc presence, for the Gondorian outpost of Caer Andros on the river Anduin had fallen, and thus they could not make it to Minas Tirith before it fell. However, there were others willing to help the Rohirrim, the Druidine or Woses, wild men of the forest in North Anorian, who offered to show the Rohirrim secret paths through the forest to come to Gondor in time, for the Druidine hated the Gorgun, the orcs. And so the Rohirrim, with aid from these ancient dwellers of the forest, came to Gondor at dawn. A wind came out of the south and blew away the dawnless day, and the same wind would aid Aragorn and his ships in the south, and would even get to Frodo and Sam in Mordor. And so, after a rallying speech, the Rohirrim charged, crashing into the armies of Mordor. The Haradrim would fight against Theoden and his men, and the chieftain of the Haradrim, whose standard bore a black serpent, would meet Theoden in combat, and he would be bested. However, shortly after, Theoden would be slain by the Witch King, only for Éowyn and Merry to save Theoden's body. But in the book version, it seemed Éowyn was slain, and she did not speak with her uncle before he passed. Merry spoke to Theoden, whom he saw as a father, and some of Theoden's final thoughts were with Éowyn, who he still thought was back in Rohan. And even Éomer would speak to Theoden, and Theoden would hail him king of the Mark. And so he died, without knowing who it was who saved his body. Éomer would name some of the nearby fallen, before seeing the body of Éowyn, his sister. He thought she was slain, and a great vengeance took him, and crying death here, rather than in Theoden's speech in the movie, he he went forth into battle. Prince Imrahil, who would be the temporary Lord of Minas Tirith after the fall of Denethor, rode forth with his swan knights, but before doing so saw the body of Éowyn, which was being carried into the city. He noticed that she was alive, and had her brought to the Houses of Healing, while Theoden was carried to the citadel for his body to lay in rest. As for the Rohirrim, they would continue forth behind Éomer King, and they would see the black ships of the Corsairs coming up the river. Éomer, believing he had more enemies to fight, made ready until, in the last moment, a standard bearing the sigil of the King of Gondor flew on the foremost ship. Aragorn and his army, Gimli and Legolas, the Grey Company, had come. Now, concerning their story in the movie, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli brought the Corsair ships up with the army of the dead, and would simply leap from the ships with the Oathbreakers in tow, and this mighty force would wipe the remaining host of Mordor from the fields and city, bringing down Mumakil. Aragorn and Gimli would slay Gothmog before he could kill Éowyn, and Legolas would bring down a Mumak with some elvish acrobatics. After the battle was won, Aragorn released the army of the dead, for they had fulfilled their oath, despite Gimli not wanting him to. In the book, the major difference here is that the Oathbreakers had already been released back at Pelargir, as told by Gimli and Legolas to Merry and Pippin after the battle and the Houses of Healing. But rather, Aragorn led a host of men from South and West Gondor, as well as the Grey Company and Legolas and Gimli, from Pelargir up the river. They would not have made it in time had the wind from the south not carried them northwards. The same wind the Rohirrim noticed during their ride, and the same one Frodo and Sam felt in Mordor. And so, with his Banner of the King unfolded in the final moment, confusion overtook the armies of Mordor, and they were defeated, ere the lords of Arnor, Gondor, and Rohan, Aragorn, Imrahil, and Éomer, were met on the field of battle. It was over. The Mounds of Mundberg would be raised to bury much of the dead, and a song named the Song of the Mounds of Mundberg would be made to commemorate and honor the dead by a Rohirric songwriter some years later. Finally, in the movie, the scenes concerning the Houses of Healing were montaged, and Aragorn healed Éowyn in particular, and she would meet Faramir and clearly fall in love with him, while the host of the West went towards Mordor. In the book, however, this chapter would be quite important to the title of the book, The Return of the King, for it is in Aragorn's healing of Éowyn, Faramir, and Merry, as well as many others with the hands of the king, that he would prove his kingliness. He did not want to enter the city and create political chaos, however, but Aragorn did so secretly when called upon by Gandalf. Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond, would aid their foster brother in his healing endeavors. I won't speak too much to the smaller changes here, for the whole chapter contains a great amount of detail, but I will say other characters like Ioreth the Healer, an Herbmaster, and Baragon's son Birgil would play roles, for Ethelas was needed by Aragorn. Éomer would learn much of what his sister had to endure when he had been off fighting in the past. Faramir would meet and recognize Aragorn as his king, and Merry would be called back from darkness, for he and Éowyn suffered from fighting the Witch King. Gimli and Legolas would wander the city and speak of its nature and stonework, knowing such things could be improved in King Aragorn's day. They then spoke to Prince Imrahil, and Legolas saw some elvish heritage in his bearing. It is after this that Merry, Pippin, Legolas, and Gimli met, and the latter two told their story of their journey through South Gondor. And that is where we will end today's episode of What's Different, as the Free Peoples gear up for their final throw against Sauron, both in the book and movie. From this episode, we see that alliance brings victory, the Rohirrim and Aragorn's force coming to Gondor, Gandalf and the others aiding Faramir, and Sam saving Frodo all show that we are stronger together. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of What's Different. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections on the differences and similarities between the book and movie in this part of the story? Let me know in the comments below. I enjoy both tellings of this part of the story for different reasons. One is, of course, more cinematic and perhaps faster paced, while the other is so much more rich with story, character, and lore. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons, Adrian De la Torre, Chris Ortner, Kyle Wetzel, Peter Sheppard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Tobias Goldner, Merton, John Hume, Reggie93, Jennifer Wood, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, Quantum Catalyst, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Ben Gardner, Kondar, and Reese Jenkins, our newest Valar tier patron. Thank you all so much, and thank you to all of our patrons. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. I'll see you all again next week with an epic character history on the Vala Ulmo, the Lord of the Seas. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.